Hello, and welcome to the second lecture for theater history this semester. Today we're going to talk briefly about mappings, about media, and about your text, especially theater histories, and we'll talk about some of the key concepts from the chapters about communication and the development of human communication, and that will bring us to a brief conversation about oral performance and ritual, and will lead into the next lecture, which will be about the origins of Greek tragedy. So the first thing is really the last thing, proceeding from the last lecture about mappings. And that's the last mapping, which discusses the myths of progress, the idea of positivism, the idea that everything is always working towards something better, toward democracies, toward civilization, toward what we have now. And the danger of that myth is that it tends to denigrate other cultures and other developments that have happened throughout the world that might not have led directly to what we experience now. For example, we're going to be looking at theatrical traditions and performance traditions that have had vibrant lives and dynamic and important parts of civilizations that have very little to do with our Western civilization, with our democracy, with our ideas about how the world works. And there's a danger in looking at history from certain perspectives that limit the ability for us to appreciate those in their context. So that's one of the things about those mappings that the Theater Histories text mentions, and that is important for us to remember as we look ahead through the semester. So, why does the Theater Histories text focus so much on media, on forms of human communication? Well, it certainly makes sense. Theater is a form of communication. Performance is a form of communication. It's a part of how we address issues amongst us and how artists and communities have dealt with their own issues, problems, and concerns through many, many periods and many, many places. But the text also focuses on media because media always affects our perception of reality. And here by media, I don't necessarily mean media in terms of television and film. When we talk about media nowadays, we talk very specifically usually about newspapers, about television news, CNN, Fox News, etc. When the text is talking about media, they're literally talking about the means of communication. So theater performance as a means of communication fits into a larger human continuum of communication. But it's important to think about how media, a medium specifically, relates to the perception of reality. For example, oral performance leads to a certain kind of perception about history and understandings of history. Writing has a very different kind of relationship to how it works toward history. And then we look at more visual arts like photography or painting, and they also have a different way of expressing the world. But what all of these forms of media do is they capture something. They capture a moment, if you will. But what they essentially say is, this is what I, or my culture, or my society, or this thing that I saw looked like yesterday, the day before, in the past, always in history. Media creates the ability for us to have artifacts, sometimes concrete physical objects, other times more ephemeral things like performances that actually express ideas about history. And this goes back to the discussion in the first lecture that I talked about, which is that theater and performance itself are always, to some extent, expressing history because they're a form of media. So, some of the forms of communication that are mentioned in your textbook. I'm not going to do a lecture here where I explain them to you. I'm merely going to reiterate them and make sure that you have looked at the text and understood what they are. The first is episodic communication. This is communication for survival, for the present only. Mimetic communication is looking at imitation, right? Mimesis, that term, it translates as imitation. We'll talk about it more when we get to Aristotle and the Greeks. But mimetic communication is usually nonverbal, is gestural, uses postures and facial expressions to express not just simple guttural sounds or meanings, but then gives them a little more context and a little more ability to imitate. What do you need speech for, right? Why do we have to communicate beyond sign language? um, beyond gestures. What's the value of it? Well, the value of language, of spoken language, is that you can create communication beyond the immediate. You can talk about things that aren't directly in front of you. Of course, different sign systems also allow this, right? If you look at American Sign Language, it also creates the ability to communicate beyond the immediate, beyond what's in front of you, beyond the visible. But if you look at episodic communication and mimetic communication, these forms of communication depend upon presence. They depend upon the communicator and the spectator being in the same space and communicating about things that are present, that can be pointed to or referred to. The last of these three forms of communication that's mentioned in theater history is the mythic. And with the mythic, you start to look at some things that look more like performance in theater. You're looking at speech and language together, and you're looking at telling stories within a community. The next issue that's brought up in theater histories that I want to make sure that you're thinking about is the development of writing, of the written language, and the distinctions that the written language have from other forms of art, including speech, but also visual art. So, for example, how is writing different from cave art? Cave art that's discussed in your text. Well, think about it for a minute. Both have artificial markings, right? But language, writing, is abstract. It's representative. The hash, the slashes and dots and things like that make up a written language, or at least certainly a Western or even a Cyrillic language, are abstract. Whereas cave paintings are not abstract. They're concrete. They're attempting to represent something by creating something that looks like it, right? It's not the thing itself, but it's something that looks like it. So this is an important distinction to think about as you think about the way that written things work. Language is always, written language rather, is always a metaphor. It's always standing in for something else. Whereas visual language, if you think about things like even hieroglyphics or the kanjis of Chinese or Japanese language, which actually have a representational past. They don't necessarily look like pictures anymore, but they come from specific pictures that look like the actual objects, like the cave paintings do. Why did writing develop? What's it needed for? Well, if you think about it very clearly, it helps to create an ability to communicate beyond the immediate. But it also allows for communication amongst people who don't necessarily know each other. It allows for the transformation of information, of communication, to travel without people necessarily being there to travel as well. And this idea of communication amongst people who don't know each other point to one of the significant cultural developments that happens when you have written language, which is that it tends to expand communities and allow them to communicate with other communities. So they become more attached to other communities. Maybe a term we might use would be something like worldly, right? They're able to start communication with other communities without necessarily combining with those communities. When we start to think about oral performance, these distinctions that we've made already about writing become very significant. It's actually very difficult, if not impossible, for us to imagine a pre-literate consciousness because we live in a literate culture. Whether we learn to read or not, I'm hoping you have all learned to read since we're in college now, but whether you've learned to read or not, you live in a literate culture. It's a culture that depends upon the written language. In oral culture, in a culture that doesn't have a written language, orality, a word, is a thought. It's not a stand-in for something else in the same way that written language is. Written language is always that a word represents a thought, and therefore it needs interpretation. And again, this is not necessarily a simple concept to think about, but if you think about the difference between speaking to somebody, where you have the context of gesture, of tone, and all of the things that come along with oral culture, and then you look at written language, which depends upon an agreed upon vocabulary and syntax, grammar, to understand, but even then, it needs to be interpreted, right? What's the tone? Think about emails that you send or text messages that you send where people misunderstand them because they don't understand the tone. They don't have the context. Emojis are trying to mitigate this issue, right, by giving a sense of tone. You put a little smiley face on the end of an email so that people know that you're happy or that it's supposed to be a joke. But who knows how they'll interpret that, or if that audience will be prepared to interpret it the way that you want them to. When you have an oral culture, those kinds of issues aren't as significant because you have a face-to-face relationship. So even if there is a misunderstanding, it can be dealt with in a relatively quick way. The other thing about in oral culture, when you're talking about oral performance, is that oral performance is composed as it happens. If we look, we're going to talk a little bit about Homer when we talk about the Greek tragedy and the origins of Greek tragedy. And oral performance is composed as it happens. It's memorized in the body and the voice, not intellectually. You don't get a text and then memorize the written text. Instead, it's communicated from mouth to mouth, right? Someone says a word and you repeat the word. Someone shows a gesture and you repeat the gesture. You don't read Long Day's Journey into Night and all the stage directions and then interpret those as actions and voice. Instead, they're communicated directly. And of course, there are some very good examples in your text of different kinds of oral performance. I think the most telling one is of the Vedas of India, the male priests who since 3,000 years ago have been trained in chanting and actually memorize these texts. They've been transmitted for millennia now through physical contact of teacher and student. There's that very evocative picture in the text of the teacher with his hand on the student's head. And they were just repeating words back and forth to each other in that case, where the writing down of the text was actually forbidden. It was only communicated orally. The next thing that Theater Histories talks about, and obviously connected to some of these things that we've already talked about, is ritual. And ritual is a term that's especially important to talking about performance because many performances come out of rituals or are parts of rituals. Rituals are special occasions. They're made distinct from everyday time, and these special occasions form and reform the self and the social identity, in which one's self and one's relationships are constituted and ordered. So that's what the textbook says. The gist of it is that a ritual is something that has to do something. But it's not like a theatrical performance, which is maybe the representation of something or a story about something. A ritual is something that achieves something. It can be a passage, right? If you think about initiations, it's a passage. You think about a wedding, right? Where you're passing from being one to being part of a different whole. But they tend to be about crossing from one place to the next. They can also be asking for things, right? So if you think about rituals that are asking for water, right? Fertility rituals in different cultures. Even things like the 4th of July, which are celebrations of certain passages of historical time, can be talked about as rituals. But essentially, rituals have to have some sort of a liminal stage, a crossing, a boundary, that makes it unusual. It's not an everyday space. There's a possibility of danger. And with that, there's also a possibility of hope, right, of something better than what currently the state is. In ritual, you experience, the participants experience real grief and real joy, not the performance of it, right? And this is talked about a little bit in your text, especially when you're looking at the examples, and I urge you to look at them, of the Hopi initiations and the Balinese healing rituals. You also have rituals that aren't necessarily performances with actors, but have different kinds of things. So the Thornborough-henge, for example, Stonehenge, those kinds of things which are set up as related to cycles of nature. And obviously, even some of the rituals that we talked about already, like fertility rituals, are often usually connected to cycles of nature, fertility rituals. And again, I bring this one up because when we talk about the Theater of Dionysus, we'll be talking about essentially a very elaborate kind of fertility ritual that's developed over time into the festival of Dionysus, which is a springtime festival celebrating Dionysus, who's the god of, among many other things, wine and fertility. The last thing that I'm going to talk about now, in terms of things to think about as we move forward, is, well, first of all, what are our rituals? What role do they play in our lives? Which is an important question that we'll talk about face to face quite a bit this semester. And the second thing is, what is ritual's relationship to theater? And this is one that gets tricky sometimes, and sometimes it's difficult to figure out. But ritual has helped shape dramatic conventions, aesthetics, and performance contexts. Things like masks, impersonation, mimesis, right? Imitation, which we've talked about, costuming. But it's not born out of it, right? Performance wasn't necessarily, or theater wasn't necessarily born out of ritual in some narrative of progress. We still have many rituals. We didn't evolve to get rid of rituals and to do performance instead. But it's not born out of it in some narrative of progress, with tragedy being some climactic moment in the evolution of civilization. Instead, we see them exist or coexist, right? They exist next to each other. And when we talk more about the Greeks, which we will do in the next lecture, we'll see some examples of how there are certainly some kinds of developments, but also things that are existing simultaneously and that are just as important and don't get diminished by the fact that some of the ritual purposes are taken over by performance or theatrical forms. The last distinction that I want to make before I end this particular lecture is to talk about the idea of festivals. And festivals have a lot in common with rituals and often contain rituals and have maybe a ritual intent. Partially, first of all, because they're not every day, right? A festival sort of by its very nature is something special. Festivals are often trying to make sense of the past in some way, honoring deities, pacifying the cosmic and natural forces, communicating with higher powers, or commemorating the human past. Some of the questions that you would ask of a festival, which is in your text, but I'm going to reiterate here, and are also questions that we should ask of any performance, including theater, is first, what are the religious and social contexts of the performance? How did the structure, context, and content of the performance choreograph civic or religious authority? How does the way this thing is put together, what does this tell us about the context of that society? What was recorded in the texts and who authored them, and were they fixed? We can learn a lot about the structure of a culture and a society by finding out who is writing them, who's recording them, who's keeping track of them, and are they changing or are they fixed? Is there some governmental or religious authority who has some say in this process? There's a lot going on there. All right? So with that, we'll leave you for now, and the next lecture will be about the origins of Greek drama and tragedy specifically. And I will see you soon. Thank you.